Since the fire he hadn't spoken her name. Then a stranger wore her old locket. The locket had a dent in it, right side just below the clasp, like somebody had dropped it on river stone and never bothered to get it fixed. I knew that dent. I'd made that dent 19 years ago on the Platte River crossing when my saddle bag tipped and the whole thing went down into the shallows and I fished it out and held it wet and dripping in both hands, sick to my stomach, and Vera had laughed at me. Said the dent gave it character. I was standing at the bar in Casters when I saw it. The woman had her back to me. Dark hair, a little road dusty, pinned up loose the way women do when they've been traveling and don't have help with it. She was talking to Cal Castor about a room, and her coat was open at the collar, and there it was, hanging on a thin chain against her neck, that dent catching the lamplight just so. I set my glass down, didn't break it, proud of that actually. I don't know how long I stood there before she turned around. Could have been 10 seconds, could have been 2 minutes. The room kept going around me, the card game in the corner, somebody's boot scraping the floor, a horse outside, but I wasn't in any of it. I was back on the Platte. I was 26 years old and Vera was laughing. The woman turned and caught me staring. She had gray eyes and a sunburned nose, and she did not look like Vera at all except for that locket. She looked straight back at me the way a woman does when she's been on the road alone and has learned to read men fast. I said, "Where'd you get that?" Not a question, came out flat. She put her hand to it, said it came with a lot she bought off a trader in Houghton. Estate goods, he told her. She'd liked the engraving on the back. I knew the engraving on the back. I had put it there. Had a man in Laramie scratch it in with a fine point, just her initial and mine, small, inside a border of wheat because Vera's family had been wheat farmers in Ohio. It took him 2 days. I gave him $3 and felt rich doing it. I told the woman I was sorry for staring, said it was nothing, paid for my drink and walked out. That was the first night. My name is Callum Rourke. I've been in Casters Crossing for 11 years. Before that I was at my own place, 160 acres on the Sweetwater that I built from nothing, me and one hired hand in a lot of years. Vera and I had been married 4 years when the fire came. It was October. Grass fire, wind-driven, the kind that moves faster than a horse if the horse doesn't have a head start. She was in the house. I was not. That's the whole of it. I don't need to dress it up and I won't. I sold what was left of the Sweetwater land for almost nothing and came to Casters Crossing because it was a 2-day ride and I didn't know a soul there and that suited me. I did day work. Fencing mostly. Timber cutting in the winters. I was good at both because they required you to keep your head down and not talk much. 11 years. I was 49 years old when I stood at that bar and saw that locket. I am not a man who talks about what he's lost. I know men who do, not badly. They're not weak for it, it's just not how I'm made. What I do is work. I work until I can't and then I sleep and then I work again. There are worse ways to pass a life. There are better ones too, but I'd stopped keeping account of those. The locket changed something. Not right away. Not in any way I could have named that first night. But I walked home through the cold and I said her name out loud for the first time in I don't know how many years. Just Vera. Said it to the dark street, nobody to hear it. The sound of it in my mouth was strange, like a word in a language you used to speak. The woman's name was Nora Bent. She'd come up from Tucson, heading for her brother's place near Fort Laramie. Her horse had thrown a shoe outside of town, and the farrier was backed up 2 days, so she was stuck until he could get to it. I found this out not because I asked, but because Casters is a small place, and everybody knows everybody's business inside of a day. I avoided her, not rudely, just I took my meals at the other end of the counter and I picked up my evening drink earlier than usual or later, depending on when I thought she'd be there. I didn't want to see the locket again. I didn't want to explain myself to a stranger. On the second day, I saw her at the livery looking at her horse's foot with the farrier, Tom Gale. She had her hands on her hips, and she was asking him something specific about the break in the shoe, and Tom was answering her straight, not the way men sometimes talk to women about horses, but like she knew what she was looking at. She probably did. You don't ride from Tucson to Laramie alone if you don't know horses. I went past without stopping. That evening, she sat down across from me at the counter. I looked up from my plate. She said, "I looked up the locket." I waited. She said the trader who sold it to her had records, rough ones, but records. It had come from an estate sale in Carbon County. A man named Clarence Webb had bought the contents of a burned homestead on the Sweetwater and sold the recoverable items over several years. She'd written it all down in a little book she pulled from her coat pocket. I looked at the book, I looked at her. She said, "I think it was your wife's." I said it was. She took the chain from around her neck right there at the counter, set the locket on the wood between us. The dent caught the light again. She didn't say anything else, didn't try to make it into something, just put it there and let me look at it. I sat with it a long time before I picked it up. When I did, it was cold from being outside her coat, and then it wasn't because I had it in my fist. I said thank you. She said she was sorry for my loss, and she meant it. You can tell when somebody means a thing. And then she asked the cook for more coffee, and that was all. I thought about that for 3 days. The third day she was gone when I came in for breakfast. Her horse had been shod. Her things were not in the room. I sat at the counter and drank my coffee and ate my eggs and told myself that was fine. She was a stranger. She'd returned what wasn't hers to keep. That was decent, and that was done. I went to work. I was cutting timber up on the ridge north of town, a contract job for a man named Hebert who was building a barn. Hard work, the good kind, where you stop thinking because your body is full up with the job. I worked until noon, and then I sat on a log and ate the biscuits I'd brought and looked out over the valley. Castor's Crossing sat below me, small and brown and ordinary. The main street, the church, the livery, Castor's itself. A dot of movement on the south road, a horse and rider moving away. I watched until they were out of sight. Then I picked up my axe and went back to work, and about 20 minutes in I set the axe down against a pine and stood there with my hands on my knees. The locket was in my breast pocket. I could feel the small weight of it. It had been in my pocket every day for 3 days, which was exactly how I'd carried it before the fire. Breast pocket, every day. Because Vera had given it to me for safekeeping the morning. We crossed the Platte and I'd kept it there and never thought much about it until it was gone. I was 50 years old, and I had been dead for 11 years. Not all the way dead. I worked. I ate. I didn't drink too hard. But there's a kind of living that is nothing more than staying upright, and that had been mine, and I had not minded it because minding things takes energy, and I had saved all my energy for not minding. The woman named Nora Bent had found my wife's locket in a lot of estate goods in Houghton, and she had liked the engraving on the back, and she had worn it for some months. I didn't know how many, and when a half-crazy-looking stranger at a bar stared at her neck and asked where she got it, she had gone and done the work of finding out. She hadn't had to do that. She could have kept it. Worth maybe $3 to the right buyer and worth nothing to her in particular. She didn't know what it was. She could have just said estate goods, stranger, and turned back to her drink. She'd spent a day running down a dead woman's history because a man she didn't know had gone white at a bar. I don't know why that hit me as hard as it did. I'm not a sentimental man. But I stood there in the timber with my hand on the axe handle and felt something move in my chest that I had not felt move in 11 years. Not grief, I mean, not grief again, but something that was the opposite of grief. Something that was about the living. I left the axe against the pine and walked down off the ridge. She was an hour ahead of me on the south road. I was on a horse and she wasn't pushing, so I caught her before the first creek crossing. She heard me coming and turned in the saddle, her hand going to the rifle scabbard on instinct, Good instinct for a woman alone on an empty road. And then she saw it was me and her hand came back to the pommel. I pulled up alongside her. She said, "Mr. Rourke." I said, "You know my name." She said Casters was a small town. We rode for a little ways without talking. Her horse was a good-looking bay, sound now from the new shoe. She sat straight in the saddle, used to the road. I asked her how far it was to her brother's place. She said 4 days in good weather. I asked her what he did up there. She said he ran cattle, not many. It was mostly her he needed. She had a head for accounts and he had none. She'd been managing a boarding house in Tucson, but the owner died and the new owner had other plans, so here she was. I said, "You don't have to go straight through. There's good water and a decent camp spot at the crossing, another few miles." She looked at me. I said I wasn't trying to detain her. I just thought I wanted to tell her something out here where it was quiet, if she had a few minutes. She had a few minutes. We rode to the crossing, dismounted and watered the horses and found a pair of rocks in the sun and sat. The creek ran low and clear. A hawk circled somewhere above the cottonwoods. I took the locket out of my pocket. I told her about Vera. Not the fire, not that part, she didn't need that part, but Vera herself. The wheat farmers in Ohio, the way she laughed, how she could look at a sick animal and know before the animal did whether it was going to make it. How she had the engraving done and given me the locket to carry because she said I was more reliable than any chain she'd ever owned. How she was right about that until the one day she wasn't. Nora sat on her rock and listened. She didn't fill the silences. Some people do, they rush in. They can't help it. But she let the quiet be quiet, and that was good because I needed the quiet. When I was done, she said, "She sounded like she was something." I said she was. Nora looked at the locket in my hand. She said, "Do you want me to take it back?" I looked at her, said, "Why would I want that?" She said she just wondered if it was hard to have it back, if it was keeping you somewhere you were trying to leave. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been thinking of the locket as the only thing I had left. She was asking me if having it back was a door or a wall. I sat with that a while. Then I said, "It's a door." I believe I said it because she was there, and because she had asked, and because the sun was on the creek, and because I had walked down off that ridge and ridden an hour to say something to this woman, and I needed to say it right. I said, 11 years I've been a dead man walking. Kept my head down and my distance, and I told myself it was fine. You did something decent for a stranger, and I don't know how to say this. It reminded me that there were people still doing decent things, and that I was one of those people too, once, and I would like to be again. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me. Not with pity, I'd have gotten back on the horse if it was pity. She looked at me the way you look at something you're deciding about. Something that's got real worth to it, but you want to be sure you're reading it right. Then she said, "How far is it back to Casters Crossing from here?" I said, "Hour and a half." She said she had never been to Wyoming before, and she supposed she could get to her brother's next week as well as this week. If there was someone in Casters Crossing who knew the country and wasn't opposed to showing it to a woman who asked too many questions. I said I might know somebody like that. She smiled, small on one side. The hawk above the cottonwoods screamed once and was gone. She stayed 4 days. I showed her the valley. I showed her the ridge where I cut timber and the meadow below it that went gold in the afternoon, and the north face of the bluffs where the elk came down in the mornings. I showed her the Sweetwater Road without going down it. She didn't ask me to. On the evening of the 3rd day we ate at Casters and afterward sat on the bench out front in the cold, and I told her about the Sweetwater land. All of it this time. She listened the same way she'd listened at the creek. Quiet and present and not rushing. She said, "You ever think about going back there?" I said, "The land's somebody else's now." She said she didn't mean the land. I thought about that. I said, "No, I think I've been stuck at the burning." She said, stuck there or stuck before it. Like you've been holding everything back before the moment you lost it, like there's still something to save. I looked at her. She said, I'm sorry, I don't know you well enough to say that. I said she probably knew me well enough by now. She was quiet for a while. Then she said that she'd lost somebody too, not to fire. A husband 8 years ago, fever. She said she knew about holding time still. She'd done it herself for 3 years and then she'd stopped doing it not because she decided to, but because she'd just run out of the energy for it. She said it wasn't brave, the coming back. It was just that grief is exhausting and living is less exhausting, eventually. I said, that's the most honest thing anybody's ever told me about it. She said, I'm not a dishonest woman. I said, I know. I knew because she'd gone and run down a dead woman's history for a stranger at a bar. You don't do that if you're not built honest. I knew because she'd asked me if the locket was a door or a wall, which was a brave question to ask a man you didn't know. I knew because she'd listened to everything I'd said and hadn't once tried to fix it or reframe it or hand it back to me in a smaller shape. It was cold, she had her coat pulled close, I could see her breath. I said, you've still got 4 days to your brother's place. She said, about that. She said she'd written to him from Castor's, told him she'd been delayed. I looked at her, said, how long'd you tell him? She said she hadn't been specific about that. I said, Nora. She said, Callum. First time she'd used my first name. I said, you understand what you'd be staying for. She said she understood it fine. I said, a man who's been shut down for 11 years. A man who's got a lot of clearing to do, a lot of quiet ahead of him and a lot of unlearning. She said she'd been a boarding house manager for 6 years. She was not afraid of work. I wasn't sure if I wanted to laugh or just feel the weight of it, the particular weight of somebody who looks at all the broken pieces of you and doesn't flinch and doesn't leave. It's different from being loved when you're whole. I didn't have words for what it was except that it sat in my chest like something solid after a long time of hollow. I said, I'm not the man I was at 26. She said, I'm not asking for him. She stayed on past 4 days. She stayed on past a week. I will not make more of those early weeks than they were. They were careful and quiet and sometimes awkward, the way it is when you are two people of a certain age who have been alone for a long time and have to relearn the basic grammar of being near someone. You forget small things, where to put your hands, whether to say what you're thinking or wait. We figured it out. There is a particular evening I come back to. Sometime in the 3rd week, still cold, the light going early. I'd come in late from a fencing job, cold and stiff and hungry, and she had made something on the little iron stove in my room, stew of some kind, beans and dried meat and dried pepper, nothing remarkable. But the room was warm and there was food and she was sitting at the table with her account book, the one she kept for her brother, working through figures for him by letter. She looked up when I came in and she said, "You're late," with no complaint in it, just noting the fact, and I sat down across from her and ate and she went back to her figures. That's the one I keep. Not any particular tender moment, not the first time she took my hand or the first time I made her laugh. Just that evening. The warm room and the stew and her quiet across the table and the ordinary sound of her pencil on the page. Ordinary. I had not had ordinary in 11 years. I did not say all this to her that night. I said it later, when we knew each other better, when I could say things like that without worrying they'd come out wrong. I told her about that evening and she smiled and said she'd been nervous making that stew because she wasn't sure if I had salt in my kit, and it turned out I didn't and she had worried it was going to be terrible. I told her it was the best meal I'd had in 11 years. She said that was a low bar, and I was probably not a reliable judge. She was right. She was right about most things. I'm not going to tell you it was easy. I'm not going to tell you the dead parts of me came back quick or clean or all at once. They didn't. There were nights I lay awake in the dark and felt the weight of everything I'd lost, not just Vera, but the person I'd been before, the man who worked his own ground and had something he was building toward. There were mornings I woke and was surprised she was still there. A small, mean surprise, the kind where you've been hurt enough times that you go looking for the new hurt before it finds you. She didn't mind. She let me be what I was, and she came back every morning even when the evening before had been difficult, and she did not keep a running count against me. I asked her once, fairly early, why she was doing this. She set down what she was doing and looked at me. She said, "When I sat down across from you at that counter, I didn't know what I was sitting down to. I thought maybe you'd be grateful and that would be that. But you told me about Vera and I saw who you were, not who you'd been, who you were right then. And what I saw was worth staying for." I said, "I'm not sure you're seeing clear." She said, "Callum, I have been doing my own accounting for 15 years. I don't make errors." I had to look away, not because I was unmanned by it, because she said it the way she said everything, plain and settled, no performance to it, and it was the plainness that got me. Being seen, being counted, being told by a clear-eyed woman who had no reason to lie that what she saw was worth staying for. That's the thing, isn't it? That's the whole of it. You can tell yourself you don't need it. You can work and keep your head down and fill the years up with the work until you can't see over the pile of it. And maybe it's even true for a while, maybe you don't need it. Maybe you get good enough at the going without that you stop knowing what you're without. But when it comes back, when somebody who has no reason to stay stays anyway, when somebody looks straight at the hardest parts of you and says, "Worth it," you remember that you needed it all along. I kept the locket. I still carry it, right breast pocket, same as always. Vera is not a wound anymore. She is a woman I loved who died too young, and I carry her the way you carry the best of what's behind you, not as weight, but as ground you stand on. Nora wrote to her brother the second month. Told him she'd need more time before she came up. He wrote back and said take all the time she needed, which she told me she took as permission. I think it was more than permission. We married in the spring. Small ceremony, just Castor himself and Tom Gale, and a woman named Hetty who ran the dry goods and had been kind to Nora from the first day. The preacher was a young man who got a little nervous and stumbled over the words, and I didn't mind. I'd said what I needed to say. What I remember from that day is not the ceremony or the meal after. It's the walk back from the church. Just the two of us, the street empty mid-morning, a sharp smell of pine on the wind from the ridge. She had her arm through mine. We walked slow. I had my hand over hers. That's the whole of it. A man walking slow with a good woman's arm through his and his hand over hers, and the ridge up there green in the morning light, and all the plain, ordinary days ahead of them, uncounted. That's more than enough. That's more than I thought I'd have again.